That summer by the harbour, when the nets hung heavy with brine, and the boats slept along the pier, as if they knew every secret of the sea, I was 10. The days stretched like old rope, each knot a new chance to pretend you were braver than you felt, and the world smelled of sun-warmed tar, damp canvas, and something sweet and sour from the fishmonger's stall at the end of the quay. I remember the mornings, the air already beginning to lift with heat, and the sound of gulls circling the boats as if circling a chorus they'd sung every summer for 100 years. The harbour wore the quiet kind of noise you only hear when you lean a little closer. The soft clack of wooden oars in the tholes. A distant dog barking in a courtyard behind the market. The muffled laugh of my cousins as we ran along the planks and thought we owned the world. The scent of salt carried with the breeze, and every exhale tasted of peppermint and damp rope, as if the day itself had a mouthful of mint to bite down on to keep from getting bored. Grandfather had a shop by the water where he fixed nets and talked to anyone who would listen long enough to tell a story twice. The shop smelled of kelp and oil, of old leather and chalk, where he'd scribble numbers that looked like weather patterns to my young eyes. He never hurried when we came inside with our pockets full of shells and a new ache to learn something useful. He'd wipe his hands on a rag, look at us with those kind, wrinkled eyes, and say that the sea doesn't owe you anything, but it will teach you with patience if you're willing to stay a while and listen. On the far edge of the harbour lay a little boatyard where a man named Mr. Carver kept a handful of stubborn boats that preferred to drift forever if you let them. He wore a sailor's cap that never seemed to fit quite right, a beard that smelled faintly of tar, and hands rough as the nets he mended. He watched us with the quiet seriousness of someone who had learned the art of letting a child discover the world at its own pace. He showed us how to coil rope with a discipline that felt like prayer, how to set a boat's mast just so, how to listen for the telltale creak when the wind found its way into the wood. One afternoon, we wandered down to the shoreline where a driftwood boat lay half buried in the sand, as if the beach had tucked a sleeping creature beneath its grains. It had a hull white as rain and a single stubborn stripe of blue that refused to fade. It wasn't a treasure, but to us it might as well have been a ship from a distant map, a thing that held a promise if you believed long enough. We pulled at its rope, and the wood gave a sigh as if waking from a nap. Mr. Carver found us there, the kind of moment that doesn't demand a lesson, but somehow becomes one anyway. See this, he asked, tracing a finger along a seam where the wood had once met water, and learned its own stubborn seam to hold together. Sea has a way of asking you to mend what you've broken, not by force, but by patient hands and a quiet mind. He spoke softly, not because the lesson was small, but because he trusted us to carry it with us after the sun moved onward and the day grew tired. We learned to unsnag a tangle with the same care you'd give a sleeping cat. We learned to thread a needle in a boat's torn canvas, to loop a line around a post so it would hold if the wind rose and the bay whispered a memory of a storm you'd forgotten to fear. And we learned to listen to the creak of the old beams as the boat settled in the water, to the wind learning the curve of the harbour, to the stories the grown-ups withheld until the moment they wouldn't. It wasn't just about fixing a boat. It was about joining a chorus you'd thought you stood outside of, only to find your voice slowly finding its place among the others. That small boat, we named it Hope, for reasons we gave ourselves without knowing why. It wasn't a grand triumph, but a quiet one. The moment when a child's stubborn wish aligned with a patient world that didn't hurry him along. If you watched closely, you could see the way the sea learned to smooth the rough corners of our fear, the same way the wash of salt water softened the roughness of old stories we kept telling ourselves about what we could and could not do. The boat would sit on the sand at low tide, ribs gleaming with salt, and a tiny flag of cloth that never quite worked as a flag, but meant something all the same to us. In evenings, after supper, was a memory we revisited with the same tenderness you bring to an old photo, the one you carry in your pocket because it keeps you honest. The kitchen of grandmother's house smelled of bread cooling on a rack, of butter melting into the last of the evening jam, of steam rising from a pot of tea that steamed the air like a pale ghost. We would sit in the glow of the coal stove, the room full of smoke from the day's work, and recount our tiny triumphs. A knot tied without help, a net straightened in a way that would make Mr. Carver nod with approval, even from across the yard. Grandmother listened with the patience of a harbour master, her eyes glinting with unshed laughter whenever we stretched a tale a touch too far. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words fell like soft coins into a jar we didn't know would keep us safe in a future we couldn't yet imagine. The harbour days linger in me, not as a single grand moment, but as a constellation of ordinary things held together by the thread of time. The red-orange of late sunsets reflecting off the water, the sound of boots on wooden planks, the way the air turned cooler after sundown, and a dog barked once from somewhere far away, as if to remind us that the world endured even as we slept. And in the quiet hours I would sit with a cup of tea, back straight in the chair my own father had once cradled, and I would feel those lessons knitting themselves into the soft fabric of me, not as a parade of instructions, but as a shape my heart took when the world offered a chance to be gentle and to stay. Years later, I found myself a teacher in a town far inland, far from the salt and rope and the patient rhythm of that summer. There were days my hands trembled with the work of bearing small sorrows or explaining something delicate to a child who did not yet understand, but a single gentle moment could outlast a storm. I learned to mend more than nets, to repair the ache of a student's frightened heart by listening longer than the schedule demanded, by letting questions hang in the air until they found their own answers inside the child, and not between two sentences of a textbook. Of course, the harbour is gone in all the ways youth is gone. The traffic now hums where the gulls used to wheel. The boats are fewer, and the lanes are crowded with boats that never know a night like ours, when the moon rose pale and kind, and the world felt as if it could be mended with a single honest breath. Yet that summer remains, not as a memory to clutch, but as a compass that never rusts. I learned to look for the seam in things. If you press with quiet hands, the old world might open up to you again. I learned that a boy's stubborn hope could become a man's patient mercy, that the simplest acts, coiling a rope, tying a knot, listening to a fault line in someone's voice, could be the small but steady repairs that hold a life together when the weather gets sharp. And I am grateful for that patient teacher who first showed me how to listen to the sea's old grammar rather than my own fear. I am grateful for the scent of salt that still finds its way into the corners of my days, for the memory of grandmother's kitchen warm with bread and forgiveness, for the stubborn little boat that refused to sink when the world seemed ready to let it drift away. Time will take much from us. The voices of children grow faint. The faces blur at the edges. The harbour's edge recedes with the tide, but meaning endures in the way a rope holds fast when the storm rages, in the way a child learns to